Welcome to Order Militaris Radio TV, and we're lifelong Catholics, and what we do is all for free, and for our love of Jesus Christ, and for our Holy Mother, the Church. We'll defend our Holy Mother, the Church. Today we begin when Jack is in Indonesia, and how things are going to take a turn for the worse for him, and with Brother Alexis Bonolo. So, welcome, brother.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on Ordo Militaris Radio TV. And this is, I think, our 8th episode
Yeah,
for the
so,
life of Jack Ryan, and we're working through and all the way up to his mysterious murder.
yeah.
And so, Jack, a little review. How does Jack get to Indonesia? Who's he working for now?
Yeah, so he's working for Brian Ingle of the Office of Public Safety.
Mhm.
And yeah, so before we move on to further, I want to say hello to Randy and Catherine. Those are Jack's kids. We're thinking they might be watching because of the stats we see coming through, and then big old following of folks from Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City. So we're hoping those are the guys Jack trained. So welcome to the program, folks, and to those who trained him and were in the police force. If that report on his death is available in English or French, could you put it on an anonymous blog and send us the link so we could take a look at it?
Yeah, that will aid our commentary for the final episode. So, if you can do that, that'd be really great. So, Jack is really Jack Ryan is a really significant figure in the history of post-colonial Southeast Asia. It's going to be the second national police force he's trying to train in Indonesia, and that is a tremendous thing, you know. So,
So,
what
if we're
years are we talking about Indonesia now? Where we are at chronology?
sure, so about 63, 64.
Hmm.
And for Jack, Indonesia was a step up the foreign service ladder in terms of living conditions, accommodations, and personal security. While the political situation was fluid, it was nowhere near as volatile as it had been in Laos. He was joined in Jakarta by his wife Janine and daughter Catherine in an air-conditioned villa within shouting distance of an outdoor pool. The 7-year-old was progressing quickly with her swimming, and her parents rented a piano for lessons. Jack wrote to George that he hoped to occasionally plunk out a few tunes himself. So, and Indonesia presented a different set of problems from those he had encountered at his previous two stops with the Office of Public Safety and required considerably more subtlety. President Sukarno was in his 18th year as leader of the archipelago nation that broke from Dutch rule at the end of World War II. The fight for independence had united the thousands of islands under democracy, but as the years passed, Sukarno gravitated toward authoritarian rule to keep his diverse people from splitting apart. He still enjoyed considerable popularity from his days as a freedom fighter, even while facing internal political opponents. The same week that Jack assumed the role as chief of the public safety operation in Jakarta, Sonaro celebrated the anniversary of his nation's independence, telling a crowd of 100,000 that Indonesia had become a regional power and no longer treated like a dummy.
Yeah, and Indonesia is one of the leading powers in Southeast Asia now. It's a large and populous country. So Jakarta, if you know, is on the island of Java. It's really hot there. I once visited Cairns, Australia. I didn't get to Indonesia, but I can tell you, if it's anything as hot as Cairns, and it's probably hotter, then you just like die there if you don't have air conditioning. But to have it, so he was in really luxurious accommodations for the 60s, and If you don't want to go to Jakarta in the summertime, but there's always summertime because it's on the equator. So, what was his
So,
specific role there in Jakarta?
yeah. Jack's assignment to Indonesia came as OPS was suffering growing pains. Lowe was unhappy with the USAID's administration of police program, believing the State Department was dragging its feet in its support. The project is buried within the USAID organizational structure, where it is separated from policy level and subjected to operational interference. He wrote, there are essentially manifestations of a lack of emphasis and a lack of understanding of the project mission by an organization which is basically orientated toward economics. Lowe had not been satisfied with Jack's predecessor in Indonesia. Project management is suffering from lack of forceful management. And he wrote, it felt the new emphasis and expanded program dictates a change in leadership. So Jack arrived in Indonesia as the colonel was ending a period of martial law initiated in response to the Islamic Rebellion in 1962. The strongmen feared the military strength had grown during the crackdown, so he began to gravitate to the left and is playing the middle game by echoing the communist appeals to the poor as his country's economy struggled. So the Indonesian army leader sent word privately to the White House that they were looking for support for a civic action program discreetly because to open collaboration with the U.S. may invite pressure from the left. The Kennedy administration special group CI defined civic action as the use of military forces on projects useful to the populace at all levels in such fields as training, public works, agriculture, transportation, communications, health, sanitation, other helpful economic developments. It read like something the CIA operator Edward Lansdale might have written in the early days of South Vietnam.
Mhm. So it's really the military that wanted Jack there.
Yeah. So Jack's budget represented the first year in the USAID would provide arms and ammunition to the police. Previous expenditures had been for vehicles, light aircraft, and communications network. Among Jack's recommendations as public safety chief in Jakarta was to increase the roles of the Indonesian National Police from 100,000 to 135,000, including a 23,000 for a mobile brigade to respond to terrorism and uprisings. He set out the goals of OPS's work as continuing development of a pro-Western and a pro-American orientation of the National Police, teaching modern law enforcement techniques and helping the police to assume a greater role in internal defense activities.
Mhm.
He wanted to limit his program to assisting with planning and believing that excess direction on internal matters increased the national police distrust of foreigners. He also thought that Indonesian police officers who were given authority would show more initiative and feel less compelled to run matters past Sukarno's administration. It was a lesson he had learned in South Vietnam while dealing with its repressive leader, Diego Diem Diem.
Okay, so high ideals there. What did he? Do we know anything about specifically what he was doing when he was in Indonesia? Did he visit all the regional capitals, or did he do all his training programs there in Jakarta?
Um, yeah, so yeah, he went to all the different areas
Mhm.
and then seeing how far the islands and then how far the Indonesia spread over distance. And he like it spreads over 3,000 miles.
Yeah, it's huge. It's a huge country, and it's archipelagos. You got to fly from island to island.
Yeah. So he writes, it is inconceivable that anyone could expect to effectively manage a force consisting of over 100,000 officers, enlisted personnel, and civilians assigned to a series of islands spread over a distance of 3,000 miles. Jack wrote, But the National Police didn't do itself any favors either, he said, in describing it as a top-heavy, poorly managed, and frustrating bureaucracy. Jack respected the mobile brigade's cohesion, esprit de corps, and capability, but he saw a large drop-off to the regular police, whom he had hoped to incorporate into the civic action program of education, health, and economic development. By being more closely identified with the population and by carrying out their responsibilities in a proper manner, the police can become a prime source of information concerning insurgency activities, he wrote. You plan to rotate the mobile brigade and police personnel through each other's ranks, believing the professionalism of the stronger officers would rub off on the weaker ones.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so he has a really good grasp for organizational development.
So then, here we go. Now we're getting to the corruption part.
So yeah, Jack, we already know from his tour of duty there in South Vietnam that when Jack sees corruption, he talks about it. So what did he run into in Indonesia?
So first from the Senator John Tower of Texas pointed out, OPS spending of $2 million for a communications network for Sukarno, and noted acidly, nothing quite appeals to a dictator like being able to keep in touch with his lieutenants throughout the oppressed nation. While Jack continues to support U.S. funding for Indonesia, he began to beat the drum on corruption and waste of U.S. taxpayers' dollars, as he had at earlier policy advisory posts. In some instances, the Indonesians have shown evidence of regarding the Public Safety Division of USAID as a shopping center or a travel bureau for friends and relatives, he wrote in a report forwarded to officials in the White House, Defense Department, and the CIA. This may well be the time to redirect the project more toward training and adoption of sound operational and management techniques rather than upon continued emphasis on costly equipment and supplies.
Yeah, because then they could be misused and taken to for other purposes. So, did Jack's recommendations get heard?
No, it's like you're going he was only there for less than a year after that.
Oh, so the people in Washington pulled the cord on him.
Yeah. Jack's professional profile had been elevated substantially by his service in Laos, the Congo, and Indonesia, all of which were viewed by the White House as critical global hotspots. He was a familiar face from stops in Washington and from visits to other foreign posts. He was politically connected not only from his own career, but from his family's association with Hubert Humphrey and J. Edgar Hoover. In short, Jack was a known commodity, organized, professional, FBI trained, and with a reputation for doing things by the book. But his resume also pointed to the fact that he was not a man who remained silent when he saw something wrong. Now this squeaky wheel was headed to the most powerful and most important office of public safety posting, South Vietnam, the biggest stage in the Cold War. Top officials in the White House, the State Department, and the CIA believe police advisory work was one of the most powerful weapons in the fighting in the Cold War, and Jack Ryan, they say, was their top man in the field.
Okay, yeah, and we're going to see this in our final episode that the family even contacts Hubert Humphrey and tries to find out what happened to Jack, and that will be a very significant fact in our investigation, which we'll conduct like Hercule Poirot, a murder mystery. So this whole time, Jack had his wife and his daughter there with him in Indonesia.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay, so it must have been a much better working environment for him, because that was his big dream, to bring his first wife Betty and Randy with him down to Vietnam. It never happened. So, what's going on with his son Randy and back in Minnesota? No.
Yeah. So while Jack was in Jakarta, he made one last attempt to strengthen the relationship with his son, suggesting that he attend the University of Indonesia. It was a tough decision for Randy, deprived of his father's presence for so long. While the adventure of living abroad had its appeal, he had found an anchor while living under his grandparents' roof and chose to stay in Minnesota. He earlier had faced a similar dilemma when his mother attempted to get him to return to California to move in with her and her third husband, who owned a pharmacy in San Diego. They wanted me to live with them. God knows why, he recalled. Bonnie rarely returned to Minneapolis after her divorce from Jack, and she missed her son. Her third marriage also would end in divorce. She ended up marrying 5 times, including twice to the pharmacist. All my mother's husbands had to live up to my father, Randy said years later in explaining the failed marriages. Bonnie put her best face on her son's insistence on staying in Minnesota and remained on good terms with Ed and Georgette. They all figured out how to raise me collectively, Randy said. Randy had learned to appreciate the stability. Marshall was the 11th and final school he attended, and the comfortable fit into the world of Ed and Georgette, known to the grandchildren as the French Peppery and Memory.
Okay, so he stayed with Jack's parents. Yeah.
Years later, Georgette would scold Randy for criticizing a young relative's poor behavior. Be kind to him, she said. He comes from a divorced family. Well, so do I. No, you lived with us, his grandmother told him. Randy learned to live by his grandfather's example, filling up his calendar with as many high school activities as he could. He started at center for the Marshall High varsity team and coached Dwayne Dietz, known by his players as Bullwhip. He also played baseball, golf, and tennis, and was senior class president, sports editor of the yearbook, a member of the student council, French club, and photography club. I had a good time in high school, he recalled. His selection as class president prompted Ed to write an effusive letter to Marshall High Principal Walter L. Chapman to thank the faculty and staff for all they had done for his grandson. Sometimes we get criticism and complaints from people, and when a note such as yours comes along, it makes us feel that our work with young people is worthwhile. Chapman wrote back, adding, I'll be looking forward to seeing you at the football games in the fall.
Well, okay. So he's following in his father's footsteps as a really active high school. Let me tell you, it's difficult to do all those things during high school, as someone might remember. They were very active in high school, but very good formative years. So this gets up. Jack returns to South Vietnam in 64 or early 65. Let's get the
Early 65.
early 65. So this is important. So Jack gets murdered in August of 65. And our next episode, are we going to arrive at the final thing, or do you want to do an episode on his activities before August?
So we're going to do the one where he's in June of 65.
Okay.
So during this time, George and Jack are writing back and forth like they do, and George is saying you might want to shut up on some of your details in your letters because you might get killed because of it.
His brother George said that to him.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was, if someone opens your mail.
And also Jack was like changing because he's like getting paranoid.
Well, you mean Jack was beginning to realize that
Mhm.
things are getting dangerous in South Vietnam. Mm-hmm.
But not from the Viet Cong.
Yeah, we're going to explain that. Yeah, we want to point out to anyone who's listening from Indonesia or South Vietnam, Jack's enemies don't seem to have been locals.
Uh-uh.
They weren't the local people. Jack's problem appears to have been the fact that he complained about mishandling of government funds in the United States and how that impacted his work in South Vietnam or overseas, wherever he was.
Yeah.
So, um,
So, June 1965, he was about to fly home from Saigon, but someone made him have a meeting with a very shadowy figure we still cannot find today. A. Lewis Russell. He was head security for Standard Oil at its installations around the world. Russell believed in a quid pro quo relationship with intelligence agencies, getting security assistance while providing information that might aid the fight against guerrilla movements like the Viet Cong. So, yeah,
yeah, if anyone knows more about this individual, uh, A.
Lewis Russell.
A. Lewis Russell. We know he worked for Esso, which was a subdivision of Standard Oil's um, um, spinoff. So Rockefeller connections, and maybe at this point in this program, we should talk about the conflict that breaks out in '64. Already in the political campaigns in the United States, Harriman's running for office. You know, we've mentioned him before,
Yeah.
and when he's in Washington State, I think it was during the Republican primary, he says that he's in favor of an expansion of U.S. military forces in South Vietnam.
Yeah.
And Rockefeller goes on record saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it was 64, 65. So
Yeah.
something's changed now in Washington. Kennedy didn't want an expansion, but Kennedy's assassinated in the fall of
64.
63, I think, right? 63. So the big pushers and shakers in the U.S. are taking a different tactic, and an expansion of military activities means that the police efforts are kind of going to be sidelined,
Mm-hmm.
and the big support Jack had in the Kennedy administration is undermined
Yeah.
because
So then we get into um the author says a few months earlier, but there was nothing going on in New York at that time. It was in 1964, after they were on the West Coast,
mhm,
that A. Lewis Russell probably was having this meeting at the World Fair in New York.
mhm,
Of And it says Russell a few months earlier had moderated a New York conference on plant security overseas that featured Air Force General Edward Lansdale, veteran of the CIA counterinsurgency effort in South Vietnam. In the Philippines, Russell was considered an expert in the field of industrial security and will go on to write a definite book on the subject. Tasks such as background screening, investigations of malfeasance, cooperative policing, military assistance, and much more can only be accomplished after develop close personal and professional relationships between corporate security and cooperating agencies. Russell wrote in the corporate and industrial security. Outside agencies can be convinced that this information will serve not only the company's interests, but government interests as well. So, yeah,
yeah, we tracked down that book. It's in a couple libraries, one in Texas, one in Australia,
yeah,
and it seems like it was sponsored by Esso for him to publish that. It came out in, what was it, 78 or 75?
yeah.
So, so um,
So, the Office of Public Safety in Washington recommended Russell to Jack, pointing out that he has been the most helpful to us in connection with several of our Latin American programs. Creole Petroleum, a Standard Oil subsidiary in Venezuela, was found by the CIA to have a larger intelligence budget and more secret assets and information than the local CIA station, according to Spooks, The Haunting of America, a 1978 book about private companies engaged in intelligence work. That is by Jim Hogan. Yeah, Jim Hogan. And I linked it on the show page where you can go to the World Book of Encyclopedia, was it?
WorldCat. It's a combined database of libraries, public and private, around the world. So you can find books if you can't afford buying the book. You can find a book where it's in the library nearest you.
Yeah, so you can learn about it there. You can track it down at your local library. It's linked to Amazon. You use copies, or if you look closely, it'll show you the link to the new copies, which you can get on paperback.
Now, if we're going in this show covering up to June of '65, we should mention that Randall is taken on by Office of Public Services in like February. And maybe just identify who Randall is. The one who is the alleged murderer, or actually he's and
so Randall Kimball,
he was he's an American citizen.
Yeah, American citizen, but he also had another job at that same time in Southeast Asia, Vietnam. He was in the jungle with the Special Forces.
Oh, that's right. He was Green Beret vet. I mean, I think he grew up in Idaho. He got a degree in geology, then joins the Green Berets, and it was the Green Berets, I think, like 6 years. And the one thing we're not too certain on whether he was still working for Green Berets in '65 or he had transferred to the Office of Public Services. But it appears that he did work for Jack. And well, if you don't know who a Green Beret is, if in the audience, that is the Special Forces, U.S.
Army,
and they're professional killers. So I can see how the Office of Public Safety, who's involved in economic development, might want a geologist in Vietnam, but to have a professional assassin in your office is kind of strange. But we'll explain that in our next program. And there's this important fact that Randall says that Jack carried a Derringer in his pocket. But according to George, his brother, he stopped that months before his death in '65. So as soon as Randall's on the scene in '65 in February, he somehow makes sure he knows that Jack carries or doesn't carry a gun. And sometime after that exchange of information, Jack stops carrying a gun. Derringer is not really a big gun. It's a little pop, Mickey Mouse kind of thing, right? But it could be lethal. Yeah. So
right up close and personal. I mean, that's what killed Lincoln.
Okay, if it's really, really close, yeah. So Kimball was aware of the security issues around Jack, to know what kind of gun someone carries habitually and what pocket they carry it in means that you've looked into that, because unless you ask a person, you couldn't really be sure unless you've seen him draw on other occasions. And we don't know precisely their working relationship, whether Jack and Kimball went out on missions together, or he's his bodyguard or something like that. So we don't know how he knows that information, but that's an important, that was an important detail that one must pay attention to in this thing. So,
Jack has this meeting, the Office of Public Safety, like, I'd meet with the guy, but don't agree to anything because the police work is more important. Can't spare anybody. So after that, he flies home.
Oh, so Jack gets some R&R?
Sure.
Okay, let's cover what follows that in the next program, because that's going to get into the intimate details of Jack's final days.
Yeah.
But we want to know more about Russell to understand what is his role there. Yeah. Because I'm not saying this has anything to do with it, but if you wanted someone out of the way who wouldn't shut up his mouth, you could either do it through government hired individuals or private hired individuals. And Russell would be certainly someone you'd want to bring in on the scene if you wanted someone to profile Jack, learn about his personal habits, and organize an assassination of him. And you couldn't really do that through open channels. Now, just because Russell's working for ESO doesn't mean he's not CIA, okay? Or at least an asset. Matter of fact, from his book, it seems to imply that that's something they would want to do. They'd want to work close with CIA to do whatever needs to be done and get some kickbacks on information that they could use there for their corporate activities. And ESO did run all, like, 147 gas stations in Saigon. Yeah. So it's not a small presence. 147 gas stations is a huge amount of gas stations. That's not just the city, it must be the whole province. So Russell is an important person because he has to handle all the reports of gas station robberies, stealing of gasoline, all that. All he has to know all about organized crime, and Jack would be someone he definitely wants to get information from that point of view. But he'd also be the perfect contact that Jack wouldn't suspect.
So yeah, when the thing in Saigon, when it gets all heated with all the thieving and stuff, they close down shop and secure everything, all those gas station oil wells, and they come back in 2011.
Oh yeah. So the company does come back, and AJ, I think you can link in the show page for our next program the map to all the ESO stations in South Vietnam that helped us understand just how important ESO was there, and therefore how important a figure is Russell. And finding out more about him is something we'd really like to do. So if you know more about Russell, let us know. So thank you, AJ, for having me on this 8th episode of the life of Jack Ryan, Catholic hero. And I guess that means our next program, we're going to open up the murder mystery and start talking about what happened, all the facts. And we may not be able to get into analysis until the program after that, because there's a lot of little details to talk about.
Yep. This is Auto Military City TV signing off. Deus Volt.
Deus Volt.